We're now in the second half of Machiavelli's Florentine Histories, and this second half is going to cover the years 1434 to 1494, the 60 years that the Medici ruled the first time around. We know they come back in 1512 and again in 1530 after Machiavelli dies, but this is the first 60 years. This is the one that most people who study the Renaissance know about. They go to Florence and they go into the Medici Palace and they see Cosimo painted in a great painting of the Adoration of the Magi. And Lorenzo de' Medici, Lorenzo the Magnificent, is known as sort of the most famous of all the Medici. So that's the period we're going to cover here. Now, although we do find that Medici mentions patronage of the arts, by and large, this is political history, and we want to remember that even this most famous part of Renaissance Florence is political in the Florentine Histories. Books 5 and 6 deal largely with Florentine foreign policy. So what we're going to do is look at Florentine foreign policy, diplomacy, and war first. Then we're going to look at the internal politics in books 7 and 8 with Cosimo and Lorenzo. So it's not exactly parallel to the first four books. The first four books sort of start out with Italy and then focus on Florence. Here we start out with Florence external affairs and then turn to Florentine internal affairs. So there is a kind of parallel, although it's an inexact parallel. At the beginning of Book 5, like the beginning of each of the 8 books, like the beginning of each discourse in the discourses, Machiavelli pauses to ponder a bit, to sort of generalize, to make some broader statements. This is a technique that Machiavelli likes a great deal. And what he says at the beginning of Book 5 is quite interesting and in some ways doesn't quite and completely fit with some of the things he says in his earlier works. Now, on the one hand, that always disturbs us because, historians and literary critics and philosophers and whatever, they go back and look at the corpus of works of a person and say, gosh, he or she changed the mind. That what he says here seems to be contradicted by what he says there, or at least it seems to be refined or nuanced or whatever. Well, of course, we all know what the answer to that is. Well, of course. People don't think exactly the same way one time as they do 10 years later, 20 years later, 30 years later. Plato's dialogues aren't a lot like early dialogues aren't a lot like Plato's later dialogues, for example. Of course, that ideas change and evolve, and also you say things and conceive of things somewhat differently depending on what you're doing. Writing a discourse on Livy is a different enterprise than writing a history of Florence. And so you are going to see things somewhat differently, say things somewhat differently, propose concepts that are a little bit different, maybe contradictory, maybe refined, or maybe just looking at the same reality from a different angle. But let me just run you through what Machiavelli says at the beginning of Book 5 because it's sort of interesting. If a nation, that can be, of course, a prince or it can be a republic, practices virtue, well, meaning, of course, using those tools that are proper to attain a good end. We're not defining virtue here in the traditional dictionary way, but the way Machiavelli uses it, especially in The Prince. What virtue leads to is a kind of quiet. It settles things down. It orders and stabilizes things and provides structures. That's by and large a good thing. But that very often leads to a kind of quiet, to a kind of comfort level, and that, in fact, eventually can lead to ruin. Well, then ruin comes along, and what do you need? You need to be rescued from ruin, and order is able to come about, perhaps through a strong man like a prince, and you need to get that order through a little bit of fortune and a little bit of virtue. So there's a kind of sense of a cycle. Now, Machiavelli does say in the discourses that the same kinds of situations tend to recur. But nevertheless, he says you can break out of that cycle, if you recall, by doing certain things. Well, here Machiavelli sort of posing the cycle. What he sees is a kind of cyclical view of Florentine history. And he, by the way, goes on and says, once order has been restored, that's when there tends to be a great flowering of culture, a great flowering of philosophy and whatever. So that, well, if you look at Florence, you say, well, we had a lot of discord, and then Cosimo comes along and sort of settle things down. And what do you find in the settling down part of Florence with Cosimo and later on Lorenzo? The flourishing of the arts and literature and philosophy and so on and so forth. So as he looks at Florence, he tries to put it in some sort of pattern so we can draw some more general lessons, not just lessons from the details of Florentine history, but lessons from the broad view of Florentine history. He also, in this, remember, he doesn't finish this book until about 1525, 2 years before he dies. It's taken about 5 years to write it, from 1520 to 1525. And he also says in Book 5 that modern history is probably as valuable as ancient history. Now, he would have said that, of course, in the Discourses, as we saw. But, he says, the reason is because ancient history provides positive examples, while modern history normally provides negative examples. That's a little bit more cynical view of the present than Machiavelli perhaps had in the Discourses. That in the Discourses, he seemed to be a little bit more that, sort of good and evil and great achievement and not so great achievement is sort of scattered throughout history. Certainly there are better periods than others, and he even admits that he probably exaggerates perhaps the goodness of the Roman Republic. But here he seems to sort of say, ancients good, us really inferior. Now, obviously, he doesn't mean that in absolute terms. He recognizes, for example, that Cosimo de' Medici is a great man. The Lorenzo de' Medici was a person of great achievements. And as we'll see, some of the ways he describes these guys fits very closely to some of the best qualities that he puts in Republican rulers or even in princes in The Prince. Nevertheless, Machiavelli is speculating, again, about broad pictures and broad patterns, and he doesn't say perhaps exactly what we think he might say, given the fact that we have been through The Prince and the Discourses. Well, Cosimo, as Machiavelli points out, maintained authority in Florence, technically sort of behind the scenes. He did not hold an office. But as I mentioned in an earlier lecture, many officials of the Florentine Republic were chosen by lot, by having their names pulled out of a bag. And therefore, if you control what names go in the bag, you really can control things. And that's really the basis of Cosimo's power. Cosimo made sure, although not all the names in the bags were his big buddies, nevertheless that his worst enemies were not in the bags, and the bags were, if you will, sort of filled primarily full of people who were the supporters of the Medici. Machiavelli also pauses briefly to tell the story of an ecumenical church council that was held in Florence while Cosimo was the leader of Florence. It is the meeting between the Greek and the Latin churches to see if they could work out the differences and heal the schism that went all the way back to the year 1054. Well, I talked about this a little bit in the introductory material. Let me, by the way, just point out that the Patriarch of Constantinople, the chief bishop, actually died in Florence and is buried in the Church of Santa Maria Novella, the Dominican church. One can see the painting of him on his tomb in the right transept there. Well, anyway, Machiavelli's not interested in the theology. He's not interested in church stuff very much at all. What he is interested in is what the politics was, how Cosimo brought the council there, and how the negotiating went. Because remember, this was a largely political deal. The Greeks needed unity with the Latins in order to get Latin military help to stop the Turks from conquering Constantinople. And it didn't quite get pulled off, as it turns out. But nevertheless, Machiavelli looks at that because, as we know from the Discourses, Machiavelli will use events in church history to serve as parallels to and analogs to events in political history. Just like he said, Francis of Assisi was the great renewer of the Catholic Church. Similarly, political institutions need to be renewed, need to go back to basics, foundational principles now and then. So this is a place where he looks at the politics of the council because it can shed some light on matters. Machiavelli pauses for a minute to talk about a battle in a town, or near a town, called Anghiari. It was a battle between Milan and Florence during the time of Cosimo. And it's a funny battle, and Machiavelli points this out, because, first of all, it was not equally important to the two sides. Florence won the battle, by the way, but he says for Florence, the victory was important, but for Milan, the defeat was unimportant. It saved Milan from just pouring in its troops to Tuscany, but it didn't really weaken Milan in the long run. It simply stopped things for a while. But one of the points that he makes about this battle is that even though the Florentines regarded it as a very famous battle, there were plans to have a fresco of this battle in the Florentine city hall, although it never came about. Let me tell you about this battle, Machiavelli says. One guy died in the battle. One soldier was killed. Now, you know that what Machiavelli's thinking is, boy, the great battles of antiquity, they were fought over big things. If it wasn't quite winner take all, it was that battles had enormous consequences and involved enormous numbers of troops. I mean, there are records of battles in Livy where thousands of men were killed at the same time. Here's this battle the Florentines brag about, and they want to paint a picture of it and put it in their city hall. One guy died. What a battle, Machiavelli says. And then Machiavelli rather caustically writes about military activities then, meaning in the ancient world, and now. Let me quote from the beginning of Book 6. Ancient and well-ordered republics were accustomed to fill their treasures with gold and silver from their victories, to distribute gifts among the people, to forgive the payments of tribute by their subjects, and to entertain them with games and solemn festivals. But victories in the times we are describing first emptied the treasury, then impoverished the people, and still did not secure you from your enemies. This is a very interesting point. Why do you have war? What's the purpose of battle? Battles, after all, are always costly in human life. Well, except the Battle of Anghiari, but you know what I mean. So why do you have battles? Well, first of all, it enriches your nation, it enriches your people, and it wins you security. That's why you fight. But when you look to see these Italian battles going on, they don't do anything like that. That in fact, the winners end up having spent all their money, and they still don't have security. And of course, that's the point about the Battle of Anghiari in particular. Florence won. They stopped the invasion of Tuscany by these Milanese troops. And then what? We go back and celebrate. We haven't won anything. It cost us money. We didn't capture any wealth. And Milan will come again. We didn't really hurt them. Only one guy died. And so what kind of battle, what kind of warfare, what kind of strategy is that? What kind of risk-taking is that when if you win the battle, you're impoverished and not any more secure? So Machiavelli is rather caustic in his analysis of the way military activities and battles take place. It's a very interesting comment that he makes. Machiavelli praises Cosimo de' Medici for being the main figure in negotiating something I've referred to several times before, the Peace of Lodi in 1454, which was an idea to bring stability in Italy by getting the five major powers, Venice, Milan, Florence, the Papal States, and Naples, all to agree. A kind of tense and not perfect, but a kind of tense and imperfect peace. Well, Machiavelli praises that, although he points out that Naples was not very happy with this arrangement because Naples was the most isolated of the five. And as we'll see, that'll get adjusted a little bit later on. At the end of Book 6, he also takes time to praise Pope Pius II. Again, remember, he sometimes uses church history to draw a conclusion that's applicable in secular affairs as well. Pius II was from Siena, and let's face it, the Florentines and Sienese never liked each other very much. But he praised Pius II because Pius II put aside his private passions, which means, among other things, he didn't like Florentines very much, and acted in what he perceived to be the good of Christendom. Remember, that's the lesson in the speech I referred to in the last lecture, that what you need to do is focus on the common good rather than your particular good. And he praises the Sienese Pope for doing that. He didn't spend his pontificate saying, now that I've got this job, I'll get those damn Florentines. That's not what Pius II did at all. In fact, Pius II was welcomed into Florence and stayed for a while, as well as going to his hometown of Siena. So Machiavelli makes note of the fact that he approves of the pontificate of Pius II. Now, as we turn to Book 7, we turn to the internal political history of Florence. We go back a little bit because what he's done in Books 5 and 6 is given the sort of Medici diplomacy and war. Now we go back and look at, inside Florence, the rules of Cosimo, brief rule of Piero, and then the rule of Lorenzo de' Medici, Lorenzo the Magnificent. Now, at this point, again, we're turning to internal affairs in Florence in this political history. Machiavelli says something I referred to in the last lecture, and that is, I'm going to get criticized for giving too much background. In fact, I remember when I was reading this and preparing for the course, as I was reading Books 5 and 6, I thought, damn it, Niccolo, get to Florence. Stop all this. Venice is doing this and Milan is doing this, and there's a negotiation here and a battle here and a treaty there. Get on with it. It's a book about Florence, for God's sake. I even wrote in the margin one time, when is he going to talk about Florence? And just as I was getting frustrated, I turned to Book 7, and Machiavelli sort of chastises me, the reader, saying, people are going to criticize me for giving too much background, too much context, but let's face it, the more context, the better you will understand. And so it's a justification for that sort of rich historical tapestry within the realm of politics. Again, he's not talking about culture and art and so on. That rich tapestry that he gives us so that we have this full background against which to place the various players in Florentine domestic affairs, which is primarily what he's interested in in this history. So it was sort of interesting to me that he caught me. I mean, I've read the book before, obviously, several times, but whammo, he sort of caught me doing exactly what he anticipated his critics doing. I thought, how'd you know that, Niccolo? You smart old SOB, you, I said to myself, but I go on. At any rate, Machiavelli, in describing Cosimo de' Medici, sums up his achievements. And I think it's interesting because as you listen to this, think about the way he talks about princes. Think about the way he talks about good Republican leaders. Obviously not quite in the same language, but here is a description of Cosimo. He not only had more money and authority than any other Florentine, but also more generosity and more wisdom. That stuff didn't go to his head. And as we know, that's always a kind of problem. It's a problem with flatterers. All of a sudden, somebody says to you, you're the greatest Florentine who's ever been. And if you got more money and more power than anybody else, it's easy to say, by golly, you're right. And Cosimo sort of kept his head on straight, if you will. He was liberal and he was wise. He was a great builder of buildings. He beautified Florence, which, as we know, is something a prince can do. You can't spend too much money, but nevertheless, you can build these monuments that say something about your grandeur and perhaps something about your kind of invincibility. It helps if you say, gosh, if Cosimo de' Medici can build that, has the money to build that, and didn't spend his last dime, gosh, this guy, is not only an enricher of Florence, but it says, really, he's so powerful. He's so wealthy. He built a new Dominican monastery, San Marco, which, by the way, later on is where there was a prior named Girolamo Savonarola. And he built the new church of San Lorenzo, which is the parish church of the Medici family. It literally faces the Medici palace. So he rebuilt his own parish church. Notice, by the way, that his grandson, Lorenzo de' Medici, is named for the patron saint of the parish, that is to say, St. Lawrence or San Lorenzo. Furthermore, he built secular buildings. He built palaces in Florence, but Machiavelli notes, interestingly, something you might not expect Machiavelli to note, that Cosimo also paid for a hospital for poor and sick pilgrims in the city of Jerusalem. That there was a kind of genuine largesse about him. He acted with modesty and behaved like a Florentine citizen. Despite the fact he had more power and more wealth than anybody else, he didn't parade it around. He was just plain old Cosimo. You'd see him walking down the street. That for all of his wealth, for all of his splendor, for all the palace he built, Cosimo was citizen Cosimo. He didn't take any titles. He didn't hold any offices. He didn't become a noble. He didn't become the count of this or the duke of that. It's always easy to name yourself count or duke of something. But nevertheless, Cosimo understood that he was a Florentine. He saw the context in which he operated, and he knew what kind of decorum would gain and keep respect. He also, in looking at Cosimo's life, says, Cosimo had a tough life. It wasn't all easy. First of all, as a young man, he attended the Council of Constance as part of the entourage of Pope John the 23rd, an anti-pope at the time. And when John the 23rd had to sneak out of Constance, so did Cosimo. Secondly, he wasn't particularly well educated, but he did have what Machiavelli refers to as natural wisdom. And despite the fact he wasn't educated, this is important, he sponsored institutions and programs of learning in Florence. A lot of people, as we know, who are not very well educated are jealous of those who are. Good enough for me, by golly, the school of hard knocks is good enough for everybody. We've all heard that attitude somewhere along the way if we pay attention to politics enough. Cosimo understood that it was important to be a patron of education, even though he was not the beneficiary of great education. Cosimo, this will, I think, resonate with what we know. Cosimo, therefore, taking all what I've said together, was both loved and feared in Florence. Remember what Machiavelli says, it's better to be loved and feared. If you can only be one, it's better to be feared than loved. Cosimo was loved and feared. There, in a sense, is a great man. He also says that, Machiavelli says, I don't want to be thought a flatterer. You know what Machiavelli thinks about flatterers. I don't want to be thought a flatterer, but by golly, it's hard not to just praise Cosimo. He really was a great man. Again, remember that this is being written for a Medici. That it's the Medici who's sponsoring this book. Nevertheless, he said, I really don't have anything really bad to say about Cosimo de' Medici. Before he turns to the reign of Lorenzo, he does comment on one of the popes during the time that Cosimo was in power in Florence, Pope Sixtus IV. He says, he really was a vile man. I don't like him. But it was his virtù, his very carefully, methodically doing what it takes to reach his goal, that got him high office in the church, which made him, of course, in a position to be elected pope. That is to say, he was Minister General of the Franciscan Order, and then later on, a cardinal. So again, you can take a look at the career of Sixtus IV and say, not a nice guy, not somebody I want to play chess with or have lunch with, but here is a guy that had a goal and knew what he had to do to achieve it. We need to look at that because we can take that model and we can use it not just for other church officials, but in the secular world as well. We know, again, how much Machiavelli likes to take these ecclesiastical stories and draw parallels that are useful outside the church and its story. In Book 8, which is the last book of the Florentine Histories, he covers the story of Cosimo's grandson, that is to say, as we know now, Lorenzo de' Medici, Lorenzo the Magnificent, who becomes the leader of Florence in 1469, the very year Machiavelli is born, and dies in 1492 when Machiavelli is 23 years old. And more than any other story in the life of Lorenzo, no surprise here, he focuses in on the Pazzi conspiracy. That conspiracy he discussed in the discourses at some length, the conspiracy in 1478 led by the Pazzi family to get rid of the Medici. Now, I want to talk you through this fairly briefly, but I want to go through some of the points because although obviously he's reiterating points he made in the discourses, he also, in a sense, sets a broader context. Again, that doesn't surprise us. He's now playing historian. And what historians do, among other things, he's already been criticized for it, or will be, he says, is to set broad, rich, complete context as much as possible. So let's start the story again. It's in the discourses, but let's start it a little bit more broadly, a little bit farther back. Okay? Peace of Lodi, 1454. The 5 major nations in Italy, or states in Italy, work out a kind of arrangement. Naples felt itself isolated, and ultimately Naples was able to convince the papacy to ally with it, and therefore what you get is sort of a 2 against 3 alliance. The papacy and Naples on one side, and then Venice, Florence, and Milan on the other side. And although it still was a peace, It was an uneasier peace because now, as long as it was sort of 4 against 1, the 1 didn't have anything to do. Once it's 3 against 2, it's a little bit fairer fight, and therefore it was a more tense political situation. So notice that although traditionally, literally for centuries, the papacy had been an ally of Florence, now the papacy is an ally of Naples, and that caused a problem. And in that alliance, what the Pope decided to do was punish the Medici, to get the Medici, because to get the Medici is in some way to get Florence. And one way to get the Medici is to withdraw a lot of the papal investments in the Medici Bank. Remember, the Medici controlled the biggest bank in Europe, and they were the papal bankers. And so basically, the Medici were fired as papal bankers, a real economic blow. And then what the Pope did was also make some really annoying ecclesiastical appointments, in particular, appointing an enemy of the Medici to be Archbishop of Pisa. Remember, Pisa is part of the Florentine state at this time. And so we have to have that broad context. So you've got the papacy acting in ways that were clearly designed to harm the Medici. And of course, what does that do? Let's say you're a member of the Pazzi family, and you're a banking family, and you're gaining from the Pope. You're gaining because the Medici are losing. And so you can imagine the Pazzi saying, we're on the rise, the Medici are on the decline, let's get rid of them. Let's get rid of them. Because they're a burden to us being more powerful economically and politically. And so a member of the Pazzi family conceived the plot. And as we know, the plot involved a number of people, not just Pazzi family, but others as well. And it involved the Archbishop of Pisa. He was in on this, even though he was an archbishop. He was an archbishop in the anti-Medici camp. Well, we know what the plan was, to kill both Medici at a banquet. Didn't work because Giuliano de' Medici didn't come to the banquet. Plans get changed. Let's get him in the cathedral. That didn't work. Giuliano de' Medici killed. Lorenzo escapes. The crowd, remember what Machiavelli says over and over again? It's really important, even for a prince, as well as in a democracy, or as well as in a republic, for the people to be sort of organized and orderly and on your side if you're a prince. The people rose up spontaneously and got the conspirators, several of whom were chopped into bits, as I pointed out, some of whom were hanged from buildings, including the Palazzo Vecchio, the city hall of Florence. Machiavelli also adds an interesting footnote. He can't help but add this footnote to it after the Pazzi conspiracy fails and Lorenzo is really restored to power. And that is, when Giuliano, the brother, died, he left a pregnant wife. And she had that baby, and his name was Giuliano, and he became, his name was Giulio. Giuliano had Giulio. Get all those guys confused. Giuliano de' Medici's son, born posthumously, was Giulio. Giulio de' Medici commissioned this work and became Pope Clement VII. So retelling the story is not just a part of Florentine history, not just a look at conspiracies, but it's also a way of telling the story of the daddy of the man who commissioned this work. So it serves more than one role in this history. When Machiavelli turned to the death of Lorenzo de' Medici in 1492, he reflects on Lorenzo's qualities as a leader, reminding, by the way, that Lorenzo's son became Pope Leo X. He was the first of the two Medici popes. He points out that Lorenzo was not a perfect leader. He was not a very good businessman, and in fact sought to buy land because he wasn't doing very well as a banker. Land's a more steady form of wealth. He praises Lorenzo for the defense and security of Florence. He not only built good structures of defense physically, but he also conducted diplomacy in a way that kept Florence, relatively speaking, at peace. And Machiavelli praises that. He praises Lorenzo as a great patron of the arts, who also sponsored elaborate festivals and celebrations. Again, think what he says about a prince. A prince needs a reputation for generosity. Spectacles are an important thing in a city. We talked about those rituals before. He also notices that, well, he thought Lorenzo had a silly side that he didn't much admire. I don't think Machiavelli had much of a silly side. He was a great lover of women and played too many silly games. So he gives a sort of full portrait of Lorenzo de' Medici. One of the final things he says, I remind you of, is that just before Lorenzo died, lightning struck the Cathedral of Florence, and once again Machiavelli says, I believe that that was a kind of prophecy from nature on the death of Lorenzo. Now, we might expect, as I said at the beginning of these set of 2 lectures, we might expect that that Machiavelli would now go on and fill in the final 2 years of Medici rule before they were expelled in 1494. But he doesn't. In fact, he does not even mention Lorenzo's son, Piero.